November 8th at a conference on Canadian science policy. I'm impressed by the large number of people here, in spite of the historic alternative you could all be watching. And by that, of course, I mean the Boston Bruins-Montreal Canadiens game in Montreal tonight. But Canadian science policy is a topic that's very important today, with a new government in place that's clearly interested in making its mark in improving science in Canada. And it's a tremendous honor and privilege for me to be moderating this armchair discussion between Minister Reza Moridi, the Minister of Research, Innovation and Science, and Nobel Laureate, Professor McDonald from Queen's University, from the Department of Physics. One of the biggest issues that we discuss in science policy, in particular in the Canadian context, is how to find the right balance between so-called fundamental research, that is research, basic, sometimes called basic research or discovery research, and targeted or applied research that is aimed at innovation or commercialization, having a direct and near immediate impact on society. So I'd like to open the discussion by asking the question, is fundamental research on the one hand and targeted research, are these two in actuality in conflict with each other?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Vicky, and it's a great pleasure to have this conversation with Dr. McDonald and yourself. It's a great pleasure and honor, Dr. McDonald, to be sitting here beside you and having this conversation.
Me too.
Thank you. The question you posed, Vicky, is a very important and significant and a very fundamental question. Actually, some years ago, just after I became actually Minister for Research and Innovation, I was asked this question by a journalist in Ottawa citizen journalist. He asked me whether there's any preference between fundamental science and applied science, and should we move towards applied science because that is close to commercialization and economic activity. And my response was, and it still is, that research and innovation is a journey. It's a journey which has a beginning and, of course, has an end. At the beginning of research and innovation journey is dreaming and imagination. And, of course, the other end is selling the products and the services. So one end, we need dreamers, people with imagination. And on the other side of the spectrum, we need a good salesman to sell the products and the services. And indeed, between the two end and the beginning, there are various elements. After somebody who is the great dreamer and with great imagination, coming up with an idea, with a concept, then of course you need to have theoreticians and people who work in basic fundamental science, and then applied science, applications, and prototyping, commercialization. There's so many elements, so many stages between imagination and dreaming until you get to the products and services, which will come as a result of those imagination and thinking and dreaming. I'll give you an example. I'm a physicist. I know a little bit about theory of relativity. When Albert Einstein dreamed that nothing can travel faster than light, and that was his dream, his imagination. And as a result of that dream and imaginations of a young man who was a clerk at the patent office in Switzerland, the whole world has changed. Today, the light we have in this room, 60% of this light comes from nuclear energy. And that is as a result of that imagination and that dreaming that a young man in 1905 made while he was at his clerical office pushing some paper in that office, but made that imagination. And as a result of that imagination, with some mathematical formulation, he showed that mass and energy, in fact, are the same thing. And this was a very disruptive idea on those days. So we see that that kind of thinking, that kind of imagination opens up the whole new world, and it did. So we need really to have people like Albert Einstein to have that kind of imagination and dreaming. And that's why the Ottawa Citizen, after having that interview with me, they put a headline saying that dreamers wanted. And the subtitle was Ontario Minister of Research and Innovation. So that's a good example, and I use this example quite often. But of course, after that, I mean, we need people of that capacity, that caliber, but indeed we need to invest and also to train people in between, from people who can make that kind of imagination and dreaming, and of course, people who can sell the services and products at the end. And also we have to pay attention to various elements in between, from, as I said, from applied research, from basic research, from prototyping and commercialization, and the various other aspects which we can get to that later on as we go on.
Art, would you like to add anything to that? Art?
Sure. So are they in conflict? No, they need each other, actually. I mean, there's a reason why Albert Einstein was put on the cover of Time magazine as the man of the 20th century, not because he invented nuclear energy or the laser or communications and so on, but because he did the basic work in science that led to all of these later inventions, with visionaries taking the basic laws of physics and figuring out how to do things thereafter. It's not just physics either. We just heard in the innovation session in the other room from Ellen Edwards that if you plot the number of citations for various specific genes and compare them with the number of patents for various specific genes, there's a very, very strong correlation between them. It's happening today as well, that there is a direct connection between fundamental science and the ability to apply that fundamental science. It happens right now that in some areas like quantum materials, the fundamental science is still not worked out. And so you really have to have, in that case, fundamental scientists working hand in hand with people who are in the process of attempting to commercialize these things. But then there's all kinds of examples of serendipitous discoveries that eventually end up very important for humanity. But there's also a general approach to supporting both fundamental research and the application of that research. And that comes really from an approach that Vannevar Bush, the U.S. scientific advisor to the president in 1945, put forward. His comment was, without scientific progress, no amount of achievement in other directions can ensure our health, prosperity, and security as a nation in the modern world. And as a result, that support in the U.S. for fundamental science, which since being fundamental, it has very little commercial return immediately, is typically done by governments. And the support that is necessary in order to translate that fundamental science into real value for the society. We should also recognize that it's not the case that it's only the sorts of things we typically envision as fundamental science that's important for the health of our nation. The social sciences are becoming very important in terms of the ability for our nation to do decisions, make decisions. We have a government that is receptive to evidence-based decision-making. There are some very important questions that have to be addressed, questions such as how do we appropriately have reconciliation with our indigenous people? How do we come up with appropriate laws for assisted dying? These are things where the social sciences have a lot to help us with, and more the access to big data, the ability to actually have that evidence on which governments can make decisions, and access to it is becoming very important. So across the spectrum, doing things in a fundamental level, as well as having the mechanisms for that fundamental science to be able to be translated for the public good, is very important, and that balance is very important. So.
Yeah. But in your view, how does a country, and in particular, how should Canada go about finding that exact right balance? Do we have that right balance today? And if not, how do you identify what needs to change and be improved?
Well, I think in Ontario, we have created that balance between very fundamental basic science as well as applied science and the commercialization of innovation. For instance, Ontario government, through my ministry, we are supporting institutions such as Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics. We have Ontario Institute for Cancer Research, Ontario Brain Institute, Ontario Institute for Regenerative Medicine, Snow Lab, for example. So we are supporting fundamental and the basic science through these institutes, or Fields Institute for Mathematics, for example. And in the meantime, we are supporting financially the applied research in our colleges, for example, community colleges. Also, we are teaming up with industry as well. We are supporting research done by industry. On the commercialization side, again, we have created, for example, risk capitals, venture capitals, in Ontario Venture Capital and a few other venture capitals we have created, so that our inventors and innovators, they will have access to risk capital. So we are trying to, we have actually created that kind of balance in terms of supporting both very fundamental basic research, in the meantime, on the other side, commercialization of research. Because research and innovation, the results has to come to the market. Today, the world is not the same as, say, 18th century, where a scientist will do research innovation just for fun or for a hobby or just for self-satisfaction. Today, most of the research is done by purpose, by planning, and a good example, again, is the invention of transistor in 1948. Bell Telephone Laboratories, they said we have to move from vacuum tubes to solid-state electronic devices. So there was a policy decision made by Bell Laboratory, Bell Company, and then, of course, they sat down and they put the theory of transistor, and they built it. So today, most of the research is not discovery as it happened in the past, in the previous centuries. It's done by planning. It's done by organizations. In old days, you know, some of the discoveries, as we know, some of them, they were just by accident. For example, electron was discovered by accident. X-ray was discovered by accident. I mean, not by accident. They were looking at something else. They found something, another thing. So that's how these things happened in the past. But this kind of discoveries doesn't happen much these days in 21st century. They're all planned. And as a result, government policies becomes very, very important. And this kind of conversation we have here with 600-700 of you in this room, I think is going to be very important, very significant for me as a minister in the government, how to shape, how to polish, how to streamline science policies by the government, because that's going to have impact in our future economy.
Maybe I can ask you, Art, do you feel that, do you think that the levels of funding and the current government agency structures are indeed appropriate to ensure that scientific research as well as applied research and innovation are being conducted optimally today?
Well, as you know, maybe others know, I've been one of the members of a 9-member panel which has been tasked by the federal government to try to learn from the community and provide feedback on the question that you just asked. Are the mechanisms, particularly for fundamental science, that's what we've been asked to focus on, appropriate? Are there gaps? Are there appropriate levels of funding in various ways and so on? And so we've been listening to the community for the last 3 months or so, and it's been a very interesting exercise. We've had 6 different sessions across the country, different diverse different groups, including diversity and older, younger researchers and so on. And whereas what I have to say is not a reflection of what the committee is likely to end up reporting, I can tell you some of the things that I've heard which people have been saying repeatedly. One of them is that for the last number of years, there's been a strong emphasis on top-down targeted research programs, perhaps at the expense of the sort of discovery programs that come from the individual researchers. And the community really seems to feel fairly strongly that it's out of balance, that the amount of support for fundamental science has been essentially flatlined for the last roughly 10 years, and therefore has at least fallen behind by inflation, but probably by more than that in terms of lost opportunities in fundamental science. So the balance, I think, we're hearing from the community between directed and researcher-initiated discovery science seems to have gotten out of whack. There's a variety of other things that people are talking about in terms of balance, the balance between opportunities for early career researchers and more senior researchers. Certainly we heard a lot from early career researchers that the programs that have been in place, which have typically been higher level programs, cooperative programs between typically more established researchers, have been a strong emphasis in the recent times, and that is creating difficulty for early career researchers to get their first grant, to get into the system. The success rates for individual grants, particularly for early career researchers, are very low. And that has another problem with respect to diversity, because fortunately, it's turning out that there's a larger fraction of the early career researchers who are women. And they are the ones that aren't getting the opportunities for these grants to get into the system and go forward. There are other diversity issues we've heard a lot about as well. So those are a couple of the balances that we're seeing as being a problem. Maybe we can talk about some others later, but enough of this particular sermon.
Well, I was very excited to hear that the Federal Minister of Science, Kirsty Duncan, has chosen to appoint a chief scientist for Canada. So I'd like to discuss that a little bit, and this is some new idea. What do you think, Minister Moridi? What do you think of this idea? And in your view, what should the responsibilities of that person be?
Well, having a chief scientist or chief science advisor is I think, is a good thing. And we did have actually in the past the Science Advisory Committee or Council for the Prime Minister of Canada, which was abolished, I think, several years ago. And in other countries such as the US, UK, they do have such a position. And in Israel also, they have a position called chief science or chief scientific officer or chief scientist. So in various countries, they do have that position. And it's still, and in Ontario, by the way, we are also going to appoint to set up that office as well, which we are working on it. But still, there are lots of questions as far as we are concerned still there, whether that position is going to be an executive position or advisory position. But just having a chief science officer or chief scientist for a province or for a country doesn't solve all our problems. In Canada, we have funding issues by the government. Our funding for research is about around 2% of our GDP. When you compare this funding with the 3.1% by the Americans, for example, or 4.2% by Israelis and other countries in Europe, particularly, they're around that kind of figures. Our investments in innovation and the research is far below our peers. Particularly in basic and the fundamental science in the past 10 years, as Professor McDonald already indicated, has declined. So we need really, as a nation, as a country, we need to pay more attention to science and its significance in economic development. Our economy is moving towards a knowledge-based economy. And as the word implies, knowledge-based economy requires investments in research and innovation, particularly in fundamental science, because if you don't invest in fundamental science, then the well is going to dry. So you need to keep always the well full of water so that you can draw from it. And that is basic fundamental science. And you need, again, not only fundamental science, you need people with imagination. So that is where we should be investing. And of course, in applied science, in commercialization as well. But as a whole, we need to increase our investments in research and innovation based on our percentage of our GDP. I think that is one thing which we should be doing. Particularly our federal government, they should be paying more attention to this area because they are the people who cut the funding in the past 10 years. The other point is the industry. Our industry's contribution to research and innovation is much less than industry in the US or industry in European countries. Our industry also needs to invest in research and innovation to a level that their peers, they do it in other countries. So these are, I think, two areas where we should pay attention. But in the meantime, having a science officer or chief scientific officer is going to help governments, policymakers. In many cases, my colleagues, they are not scientists themselves. We know politicians, they come from all kinds of backgrounds. So having an advisor, I think it would be very helpful in the future. But on its own, it's not going to address those questions which are really fundamental to advancing our knowledge-based economy.
Now, Art, I'm going to guess that you also think the idea of having the chief science officer, chief scientist is a good idea, but I'm wondering what you think, what sort of support and resources will that person need in order to be effective in their role?
Well, there was an excellent talk given actually at this conference here in Ottawa last year by the chief science advisor to New Zealand, who I think has served 5 successive varying governments and been regarded as very valuable. He had direct access to the Prime Minister. He was respected at a very high level, and his advice was needed in several situations where they needed a decision today on something that related to science matters, but also from the point of view of a long-term perspective. But I think there's also a nice example in the United States where they've had a presidential committee of advisors on science and technology, the PCAST committee that has been in existence for many years, at least 30 years, where there is a group of individuals who are representative of fundamental science, representative of industry, but whose perspective is to advise the president on those things that are of importance to the country as a whole with respect to the appropriate levels of funding for fundamental science and for ways to translate that fundamental science, among many other things. But I think in this case, what we need is advisors to that chief science advisor who are independent, who represent the community broadly, represent not only the scientific but also the social sciences community, for what I was mentioning earlier on, and humanities for that matter, but also represent innovation and can provide an overview. We're hearing a lot from the community that they would like to see more coordination of the activities of the various Tri-Council and CFI agencies. That's not a short-term thing where you say you should do this and that'll solve the problem. This is something that needs to be looked at on the longer term. A council of advisors that could provide appropriate advice with and type of feedback from the community that our panel has been receiving over the last few months. Seems like a good mechanism for having that happen. There are also, certainly there was a very strong statement from the community that big science doesn't have a mechanism for being handled appropriately, that there isn't a way in which you can have a new idea that might be of a larger than normal funding implication handled in such a way that it receives the appropriate respect, perhaps at that point needs some development funds, needs to be appropriately evaluated. There are many mechanisms within the various federal agencies for doing evaluation of such things. CFI does it very well, for example. But a coordination on the longer term, the cradle-to-grave approach to trying to understand big science projects, including the question of when the task has been completed and they should be shut down so there's money for others to take their place, is something that, for example, could be a subcommittee of a broader advisory agency, we've been hearing. And the community, I think, would welcome that sort of committee. Certainly has been recommended many times, going back to probably at least the 1980s. Janet might be able to tell us it was even earlier than that it was recommended. It certainly was recommended by Art Carty in around 2006 in a very careful study of the topic. So those are the sorts of things that the community would like to see, I think, in terms of advice external to the government by representatives of various elements of the community that's affected by the decisions that are made.
Yeah, and as a basic researcher, I do astrophysics. Every one of those things you said you've been hearing, I second. I mean, I think those I strongly agree with.
Just if I may, just add a few things, a few words to what Professor McDonald just mentioned about science officers' position and duties. One of the things in the governments which we could be very beneficial of having such a committee and such a person chairing that committee in the capacity of chief science officer for the government is using their advice in terms of making policies in various areas of the government. Because policy making is traditionally based on what people think. So evidence-based or scientific-based policy decision making has become much more fashionable, and indeed there is a need for it. I mean, when you're going to make a policy decision in the government about, for example, climate change, this is a scientific issue. It's not based on feelings of people. It's happening. There's a science behind it, and any decision by government should be based on science. So on such things, a science advisor or chief scientific officer, or the committee which the person might be chairing, could be very helpful for decision makings at the highest level of government. So that could be another area where governments can move their decision-making from the state as they are now to a scientific-based or evidence-based decision-making process, which will be much more better indeed.
Let me sort of follow up to that with a question that I've struggled with and wondered about. And, so for example, we're all physicists apparently, so, Michael Faraday was busy in the 1800s playing with little bits of wire and magnets, discovering the laws of electricity and magnetism. And yet the impact of his work is still evolving, creating technological revolutions, even today, new apps on cell phones and new ways of communicating. So what I'm wondering is there a fundamental conflict between the long timelines sometimes needed for societal scientific impact from genesis to practical outcome, with those that are built into government structures and that are necessary in a democratic society that tend to be shorter term, few years to changes over in government and things like that. Is there a fundamental conflict there?
Well, I don't think, but as you said, I mean, Faraday experiment was very simple, and the Faraday wasn't alone actually in that respect. When again you go back to the 19th century or early 20th century, the apparatus used to make those very fundamental discoveries were very simple. I mean, some years ago, a few decades ago, at Cambridge University, at Cavendish Laboratory, they showed me the apparatus which J.J. Thomson used to discover electron. I guess in today's money, you can buy that, or you can ask someone to build that equipment for you with $100. So with something of $100, you come up with an apparatus which you make huge discoveries, or the discovery of X-ray again for that matter, or radioactivity by Madame Curie and Henri Becquerel. And so on those days, the big discoveries happened by very simple apparatus. And when it came to theory, actually there was no apparatus. Now, speaking of electricity, we should mention about James Clerk Maxwell, right? He wrote 4 mathematical equations, and with 4 equations, he explained the whole science of electricity, the whole science of magnetism, and also the whole science of optics, the science of light, and showed that these 3 branches of sciences, actually they are one thing. It's only one, and its origin is electric charge. And in those days, electron wasn't discovered, so nobody knew what is this, the meaning of electric charge. People use this called electric charge, but nobody knew what this electric charge is, because electron atom wasn't discovered at that time. There is a story that Maxwell and the British Chancellor of Exchequer, meaning their Minister of Finance, they didn't get along well. Dr. McDonald maybe may know that story. So one day at Buckingham Palace, apparently, the Chancellor or Minister of Finance, who didn't like Professor Maxwell, said, "Professor Maxwell, I hear that you have written 4 equations. What is the use of these equations?" So he thought for a second and he said, "Well, I tell you, Mr. Chancellor, if you remain Chancellor of Exchequer for another 20 years, you will be taxing on the results of those 4 mathematical equations."
20 years. Was it 20
he said
years?
20 years. So I don't know how many years it took until Edison and others, they discovered electricity and all of that. But that is the reality. I mean, what you come up with a mathematical theory, somebody will tax as a result of that. Albert Einstein's imagination of nothing can move faster than light, how much taxes are we paying on just on the using electricity today in Ontario? So this is actually a good example how fundamental basic science is very important, is very key to our economic development. And for us as a nation, as a society, as a province, if you're going to move from traditional manufacturing, as we have no choice, to science-based, to knowledge-based economy, we need to invest heavily. We need to invest heavily. 2.1% of GDP in research and innovation is not adequate. Alison Barr is sitting there, and so you have to talk to Deputy and, of course, other colleagues. But I think in the federal government, we have to ask our federal government to invest more in research and innovation, and again, our industry as well, because this is not only government's duty, industry as well, so that we can move faster towards a knowledge-based economy. If we don't do it, the others will do it. There's a competition going on. It's not only Canada. All Western countries, they are facing with this reality, and the reality is that we in the West cannot compete with low-wage economies. The only way for us to compete is based on our knowledge, and that requires investments. And investments should come mainly from government when it comes particularly for big science. And on the applied side, of course, industry has to contribute as well.
Would you like to add anything to
I
that?
have to say it's really a pleasure to have a Minister of Science and Innovation who actually is a scientist who can speak in that way and also welcomes a chief scientist and external advice. So that's very good to hear. But inherent in what you were saying is that fundamental research takes a long while, and that the expectation should not be that that particular piece of discovery-based research will necessarily give you a response tomorrow. We have to have the mechanisms whereby you can translate discovery-based research into economic value, which is the topic of our session. But you have to, I think, have those mechanisms, but also provide sufficient support that the health of the fundamental science, such that the ideas still keep coming, is there. But we just came through a session in talking about the translation of fundamental ideas into innovation, and there were some very nice things said there too, which I've heard in many cases as well. In this case, not with our panel that's dealing with fundamental science, but in other circumstances where the feeling is that you need to have an attitude among our young people who are you need to have a graduate of a Canadian university saying to themselves, okay, when can I start my own company when they graduate, as opposed to how can I get a job working for someone else, which, I mean, the former is sort of the attitude of people who graduate from, well, MIT was being used as an example quite a bit today. And so entrepreneurial ideas within universities, and in fact in some universities you have floors of entrepreneurial students in the dorms, and there's a new program at Queen's where the business school is working with other engineering and science groups to try to get entrepreneurial spirit in there. That's needed. What's also needed, however, in general for our knowledge-based economy that's going to go forward is students who have been trained in doing research. I mean, we really need people who perhaps were trained in fundamental science. Actually, Sandra Noel, who introduced us at the beginning, is now involved in science policy, but worked on the snow experiment when she was a student. We need people who, when they are students, get the opportunity, first of all, to get the basics in their discipline, to be able to then understand how to make a new idea work, whether they're dealing with something fundamental or whether they're dealing with something that is going to be innovative and commercially valuable. So that basic education is going to be important. Having them also have the ability to participate in research, to realize what it's like to make a discovery, to realize what you have to do in order to make a discovery is important, because it was said also today that about 80% of the students who are trained in fundamental science do not end up in academic positions. They end up very often in very responsible positions in our knowledge-based economy. So I think another reason for supporting fundamental science is, in fact, that group of people who are trained to be scientists, which is what's needed in our knowledge-based economy, but it's also such that we should not ignore the necessity for an entrepreneurial spirit in the process as well in our universities. I think that's where it's best placed.
Just on that point, if I may add a few words. In the past few years, actually, in Ontario, we have made good progress. We have created 44 or 43 campus link accelerators in every university and the college in the province of Ontario, whereby students and innovators and inventors, those researchers from the academic institutions, they will have an opportunity to use the mentorship and resources which these campus link accelerators provide to them, so that they can bring their ideas into the marketplace. And as a result of this activity, last year in Ontario, there has been, I believe, 6,000 startup companies formed, which is quite promising. But indeed, we need to move these startup companies to scale up to become $1 million company, because we know that many of these startups at the end, they're swallowed by big corporations, big companies. But connecting in this academia to industry, I think that is a major step forward, so that universities and academics and students, they don't live in isolation. Again, this is in contrast to, say, 100 years ago. Nowadays, there's a much more connection between academic institutions and industry and the business. So those campus link accelerators, they are acting as a bridge between academia and the business environment. But along with that, we have created 18, we call them regional innovation centers, institutions such as Mars in Toronto, which is the biggest incubator in Ontario, or research park or commercialization park in North America. This is located in the municipality, or Communitech in Waterloo, or Invest Ottawa here in Ottawa, and a number of others. So these institutions, they are there basically to help inventors and innovators to bring their ideas and their inventions into the marketplace, because that requires a very specialized talent. because researchers and scientists, in some cases, they don't know business, and not necessarily we should expect them to be familiar with business tricks, so that they need some help, and those institutions are created and they are there to assist. But again, we need to try to scale up those startups so that they become a BlackBerry, they become a Desire to Learn, for instance, they become Shopify, bigger institutions. We have been very good in Ontario in terms of startup companies. Ontario ranks, actually Toronto ranks number 8 in the world in terms of number of startup companies, and Kitchener-Waterloo ranks number 16. So we are doing very well in terms of, as a province, for startup companies, number of startup companies. But in terms of scale up, we are still far behind. Some of our startups, they move to Silicon Valley or to Boston. So that's an area where we have to work a little bit more to make sure that our companies' ideas remain in Ontario and they become big companies.
Okay. I'm going to ask one more question, then I want to have a brief Q&A. So people should start thinking about what questions they might want to ask. We have 2 mics over here, but I guess I had several other questions, but in light of the time, I'm going to ask one last question. Mobilizing greater numbers of potentially important research contributors, such as those that are not currently well represented in science, women and minorities, is one mechanism for improving the research landscape. Should our funding bodies be addressing this issue of underrepresentation through formal policies?
I would say yes, but I'm going to turn the question around and ask you to answer it, because you're better qualified to answer it than I am. What do you think is missing in terms of diversity questions, Vicki? You've done very well, first woman to receive the Hertzberg Prize and so on, and I know it's something that's been of concern to you personally. What do you think should be done?
Well, it's a great question. So well, I think first, number one, it has to be recognized by, in my opinion, it has to be recognized by everybody that these problems really are societal. That it starts at kindergarten, and the different types of subtle messages that I believe people get throughout the course of their education and then their careers, they add up. And so I think there's no silver bullet. There's no one place that is going to solve everything. But on the other hand, that said, I think there are things that have to be done at every level in order to address this problem. And so, in terms of policy, which is what the question I was putting to you, I think that there's, having, for example, for the topic of women in science, that's one that I've most familiar with and have most experience with. There's issues of culture and there's issues of practicality, and those are 2 very different sides of the coin. Cultural issues, improving environments, improving the overall feeling atmosphere, raising consciousness of the different types of problems that women feel in the different sectors. But then also practical issues like maternity leaves and flexible types of options in doing work, being able to work from home or being able to take time off as needed. So I think all of these first you have to identify the different points that are relevant, and then you want to try and address them. But I guess so I was asking this question, so you rightly recognize that I have opinions on this, and thank you for that. But I would just like to also, hear, for example, from the minister, is that something that your office and you consider and think about in the overall broader picture of science and technology?
Well, for sure, there's a need for governments to consider this reality. That's not only reality in science, I mean, every aspect of our society, participation of women is less than men, basically. Like Ontario legislature, for example, number of men MPPs are more than women. In the cabinet, Ontario cabinet last June, Premier Wynne shuffled the cabinet and added a few more ladies to the cabinet, but still there are 60% of our cabinet are men, 40% for women, and that is a great achievement because for the first time in the history, 40% of Ontario cabinet is women. So I think that is an issue in the society, but as you mentioned, this is cultural, for example. When I was a student myself several decades ago, in my class we were 70 students, there were only 2 girls, and the rest were boys. But today I see that many girls, they are doing physics and the mathematics and the science. So the world is changing, and the culture is changing. But in the meantime, governments also should have certain policies to facilitate this change. The faster, of course, the better. That's what we all should be working in that area. It's not, as you said, there's no silver bullet for that.
Okay, well now we have 10 minutes left. I would really love to open the floor to questions.
And there's at least 15,000 researchers and scientists represented by our union PIPs, and I'd be very interested to hear the opinion of the speakers on where you see government research and government researchers fitting into both the research ecosystem and also the specific topic of this discussion, that the whole fundamental science to industry and innovation, a spectrum. Thank you.
Well, government researchers are not different than other researchers, right? So people who are working in universities, for example, publicly funded institutions, they're also, in a sense, funded by the governments, funded by the public. I guess the same is true. But of course, the government agencies, they have a specific mission so that they use services of researchers in order to perform that specific task. For example, if you're working in Health Canada, for example, you're working on certain approval of certain medication, drugs, for example, so you will be researching that particular field. So your work might be more directed towards applied research. But if you are working in a government-sponsored, for example, Ontario Institute for Regenerative Medicine, working on stem cells, for instance, very fundamental basic research, it's again funded by the government, but you're working in a very fundamental basic research. So it's the same thing in my view. It's not very different.
Okay. Did you want to add?
I was simply going to say that I agree that it should be very similar for government workers as for the rest of the scientific community. I think the opportunity for a relationship between fundamental science and government, often more industrially oriented or policy oriented science, is important. And I think connections with the universities is a very good way for that to happen. In other countries where they have institutes or government agencies that are rather specifically oriented towards things related specifically to the interests of the government, there are very often strong connections to universities such that that fundamental work that's being done in the universities gets translated into the sort of evidence-based decision-making that you want to make as a government scientist. So,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Let's alternate microphones. So from this one.
Thank you. I'm Alicia Main. I'm a professor of innovation and entrepreneurship at SFU. I really enjoyed all of your comments. Thank you very much. You talked about a number of things, including the importance of investing in our scientists and maintaining and reclaiming our leadership role in science. And then those 80% that don't go on to academia and having them have links to the knowledge-based economy. And then it was also spoke about accelerators across Ontario and across the country and the role that they can play in helping ventures get out into the Canadian economy and seed clusters. I wonder what you think also of a program like NSF's I-Corps, Innovation Corps in the States, in a role that it could play in not just helping the scientist who is ready to launch a venture, and often it's kind of a more close to market technology that they're going to be commercializing through an accelerator, versus helping to train them for a lifetime of being able to be a link from science to our knowledge-based economy. Are you familiar with the Innovation Corps? It's funded by NSF in the States.
Well, we do have a similar system in Ontario, for example, Mars or Communitech, or in universities, for example, accelerators we have created. The most prominent one is DMZ, Digital Media Zone at Ryerson University, where students and also profs, they get assistance in terms of commercialization of their inventions and innovations. So we do have that system in place. And on the other side, we have created venture capitals in the past several years. In 2005, for the first time, we created Ontario Venture Capital Fund with $200 million investments from the government, and then private sector came in, and I believe they added another $600-700 million to the fund as well. Then a few years ago, we created Northly Venture Catalyst Fund with $50 million from Ontario, $50 million from the feds, and I believe $300 million from the private sector. And then now we are in the process of creating a new venture capital fund for scale-up venture capital fund in order to help startup companies to grow. That's in the making. And also we are studying to set up a few other venture capital funds as well to address the specific sector, for example, life sciences sector, regenerative medicine, and so on and so forth. So these elements are needed in the society in order to really take us to the next level in terms of innovation and commercialization of research, because that is very important. If we don't do that, others are going to do it. If we don't bring the results of our inventions to the marketplace today, other countries, other people around the world, they will be doing it. They will do it. Whoever brings the product to the market, that person or that company is going to occupy the market. So it's very key to bring the inventions to the market as fast as possible. And we have to be very, again, careful in terms of commercialization. As you know, insulin has been discovered in this country about 5 years ago, and that we will be celebrating 100th anniversary of the discovery of insulin, I think 2022, I believe. But the discovery was basically, the patent was given free to a German company, I believe, to a European company. Susan, you should know the name of the company, right? Is it Eli Lilly or? Eli Lilly, yes, they got the patent. So the patent free. So we shouldn't be doing this. We should be very careful in terms of, because this is a property. When we think about natural resources in Canada, this is something we talk a lot about it. We say, this country is rich in natural resources, and by natural resources we mean forest and the minerals. But another natural resources which we have is the findings of research and innovation, which sits in the, in journals or in computer hard drives or in laboratory test tubes, et cetera, et cetera. We need to bring these to the marketplace, these natural resources to the surface. And for doing that, of course, we have to have some tools and the means which we have created them, but we have to expand them.
My question concerns dealing with failure. In this innovation ecosystem, you're talking about including scientists and startups. And scientists are familiar with failure because they get lots of negative results. Startups often go bust. But policymakers are usually quite reluctant to acknowledge or to admit failure. You can point to any number of examples which are somewhat controversial, and so that's sort of besides the point. But say you brought up Mars, which may be a great hub for things, but it's also been criticized as quite inefficient. In predicting science grants, it's hard or possibly impossible to tell in advance who will be successful at funding new science. And the inability to acknowledge that, no, we really can't predict this may be a factor responsible for a lot of bias and mismanagement in the granting system. In any case, whether or not these specific examples are true or not, the point is that in any new initiative that's innovative, you are likely to encounter failure. So how should policymakers respond to this, and what is politically possible?
Well, in an ideal peer review system, the thing that's on the table and being proposed is the thing that's being evaluated. And so if the second idea, which came perhaps by being educated as a result of failure, results in a better thing being evaluated, then hopefully the system works appropriately to give the proper response to it. And so within the system, as long as one adheres to peer review in its best operated way, then even failures are not ultimately failures. They're simply learning experiences for the next thing that someone comes forward with seeking funding. So I think at the level below the policymakers, there's a system that hopefully will deal with the sort of thing you're dealing with.
Okay, and then what about at the level above?
That's really what you're asking. Yeah, very briefly, do you think, do you want to address that, Ms. Moridi? Because that's a question really for you. Briefly, because I do want to try and get one more.
Well, when you're doing the research and doing science, of course, you can't predict whether you're going to succeed or you're going to fail. But of course, you do your best, and sometimes you are looking for something, you find another thing which could be much more important and much more significant than the thing which you were looking for it initially. A good example is, I indicated earlier, people were looking for something different, and then they discovered the X-ray or they discovered the electron. This is in the history, of course, the history of science. So still it's the same thing. If you cannot just say, okay, well, I'm doing science, then 100% I'm going to get there. You may get there, you may not. I mean, there is a risk in every human activity. There is no human activity, even eating and drinking, is without risk. So you have to be prepared to take risk in any activity.
Okay, well, the light is flashing at me that time is up, and I understand a plane has to be caught, and so I certainly wouldn't want that to not work out. So I'm sorry to the people who still had questions. I don't know if perhaps if someone is sticking around a little later, they might be willing to answer them privately up here, but I guess I would just like to thank our panelists again. I think this was very interesting and really very fruitful discussion, and also thank you for entertaining some of these questions so eloquently.
And thank you, Vicki.
Thank you, Vicki. Thank you.
As a gift to speakers, we have made a $1,000 donation to the Canadian Science and Technology Museums Foundation to purchase museum family passes on behalf of CSPC 2016. These passes will be distributed to social services organizations throughout Ottawa.
This panel has been particularly inspiring to me personally, and I would like to point out that I'm kind of appreciating a moment here where the number of women who've studied physics on this stage outnumber the men.